And so next, we have two incredible individuals that are joining us for the next session. And we're going to tie this into the bigger theme that we began this morning about social transformation and consciousness and the I to the we. And so the individual I'm going to introduce to you, we did not have him initially. And so if you went on the website, he was not there. But thanks to Abdullah Antepli, we were privileged to be graced with Professor Omid Safi. He is the director of the Duke Islamic Studies Center. And he's been affiliated with the American Academy of Religions. He is a frequent speaker. He is a scholar of Islam. He was previously at Chapel Hill. And he has several books. So earlier we talked about books written about Islam or Muslims by those who really are not from the Islamic fold. Well, here's somebody who is from within the Islamic fold, championing the ideas and thinking within that literary space. So we have him, and we, along with him, we have our very own co-board member, Abdullah Antepli, that the Charleston community knows well. He's also somebody hard to track down because he's always hopping around somewhere. A beautiful man, and he's also at Duke. He's a chaplain there, and he's just become the chief representative of Muslim affairs. So the chief representative for Muslim affairs for Duke University. So that is quite a bit of an honor. And so I'm going to ask them to come forward and tackle this next topic, being a global citizen, within the context of what we're talking about.
All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you all friends for having come from near and far. I'm going to try to not speak too fast because I'm so inspired by what I've been listening to this morning and this afternoon. And inshallah, we will have some of the themes that have come up. The theme for transformation, which begins in the heart and the spirit and perpetually spills over, so that the transformation of the human subject is linked together with the transformation of society, the transformation of the world. The theme of social entrepreneurship, which I might push back against it just a little bit, because I want that process to also go hand in hand with our engagement with and our critique of government activity and straight up business activity, and then the ever necessary work of education, which occasionally feels is just as much necessary here in America as it is in Pakistan, where the challenge is not so much illiteracy, but rather it's illiteracy with respect to Islam, illiteracy with respect to the Middle East, illiteracy with respect to, in fact, entire segments of American history that it seems like people have never known, or if they did, they have long since forgotten. So what I want to do is I want to begin, there's a wonderful teaching that comes out of the heart of the Islamic tradition, which states, have your heart be where your feet are. Have your heart be where your feet are, right? This is really the greatest embodied practice of living in the moment. And so where are our feet? Not just in this heavenly-like location in West Virginia, but at this crucial moment in American history where we are seeing in so many ways the crumbling of the country that used to be the largest economy, the largest military, the largest whatever in the world, and in so many different ways, militarily, politically, as a civic experiment, and perhaps even morally, we see this country coming undone. And the question that I want to ask is, what do we have to say? What do we have to bring to this conversation? I am somebody, and I've raised my own children and my students to be this, that I take my Americanness, my Iranianness, my Muslimness, my adopted Turkishness, I take all of these as non-negotiable, right? When somebody begins by demanding for me to perform my Americanness, prove my Americanness, I just tell them, screw you and be off, right? Because it's not simply something that I'm even willing to negotiate. Right? My life is too short to spend doing that. Part of the concern that I have is how do we get beyond the point of we too have this, right? That was one concern that I had about the conversation we were having about, well, Muslims too invented capitalism. The part that I want to ask is, let's take the pulse of this world that we have all inherited and now inhabit. And here's the state of that world. 1 out of every 5 people on this planet lives on $1 a day. And we're not just talking about people over there in Africa and Latin America. If you want to start with where your feet are and where your heart should be, the America that we now live in is an America where 20% of our precious children live in poverty. All of our children. 40% of our black children, brown children, and Native American children live in poverty. Right? These are not just our future, these are the most precious, most vulnerable people in our community, and that's where they're living. So the question that I really want us to be asking, as a people of faith, who are also among the most successful people in the society, what do we have to say? What do we bring to the table? How do we want to engage the paradigm and say, the paradigm is working for a small elite on top and not working for an entire swath of the population? The starting point of it for me is that of every person and of every community, we want to ask 3 questions, 3 challenging, fundamental questions. And it starts with the heart, because that's what Muslim transformation is. We cannot change the world until and unless we have also transformed our own selves in the process. So much of what we heard this morning through Marilyn's brilliant talk has, of course, echoes and parallels in the grand Islamic tradition, but it's also not an individual process of transformation, but a communal one. I can't get to where I want to get to until and unless we get there. And for those of you, I've seen friends from Pakistan, from Syria, from Palestine, from Turkey, from lots of different regions. If we know our own tradition, if we actually admit that the illiteracy towards the vast spectrum of our own tradition isn't just a problem of those idiotic Americans out there, but also of our own community. Most of us have never had the chance to know the full spectrum and the full depth of our own tradition. That's when we're going to come across teachings from extraordinary sages like Maulana Rumi. We'll have an argument later about if he was an Afghan, a Persian, or a Turk, or really from San Francisco, right? Where he tells us, you and I have to live as if you and I never heard of a you and an I. Right? This is where love goes from not just this private, emotional, mushy thing, but love really becomes, for us in the Islamic tradition, the very unleashing of God into this realm. Love is the sacredness that creates, it's what sustains, and it's what's going to deliver us home. And there is a power to love. This isn't roses and hallmarks. This isn't Valentine's Day. This is the very core of being, as the great scholars have told us. So the first challenging question that I always want us to ask ourselves is, how deep and wide is our circle of love? Where do we draw the line? If it stops with just myself, my 3 favorite people in the world being me, myself, and I, right? That's egoism. That's narcissism. If you expand the circle just a little bit beyond that and you say, my babies, I love my babies. I would do anything for my babies. Beautiful, moving beyond narcissism, but we're still trapped in nepotism. Because everybody's baby is sacred, everybody's life has value, not just because we're told in the Quran, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, that God had breathed his own spirit into humanity. Everybody's beautiful and sacred because somebody has paid for you. Somebody stayed up at nights with you. When people say you sleep like a baby, it just means you wake up with a wet bottom every 2 hours, and somebody has to get up and clean your bottom, nurse you, rock you until you fall to sleep for another 2 hours. This is how we torture people, is by waking them up every 2 hours, and somebody, usually your mama, has suffered for each and every single one of us, and that includes the 20% of the children who are now hungry in this country, as it does the 1.5 billion people around the world who are living on $1 a day. What do we have to say to that suffering? If we keep expanding it and it encompasses our own ethnic community or religious community, great and even bigger. But then we're still guilty of remaining trapped at that level of ethnic or religious chauvinism. Our religion is not a tribal religion. We do not begin our Quran with Alhamdulillah Rabbil Iraniyin, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Pakistaniyin, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Turkiyin. No, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, which isn't just this world, it's as many different cosmoses, universes as there are. What does it mean to be a global citizen? The earth is just a small little tiny blue dot in our realm of love and concern. The prophet that we follow, the fragrance that we want to wrap ourselves around, was called Rahmatun lil Alameen. Right? It's a mercy to all the universes. That's what we are constantly pushed to do. To move beyond the boundaries of our own ego, our own family, our own ethnicity, even our own religious community, and to stop at nothing short of the totality of humanity, the totality of existence as such, because it's sacred, because it's good, fundamentally. So if the first question is how deep and wide is our circle of love, the second question for me always remains, where do we stand in relation to the suffering of the most vulnerable people in our community, which is why I'm so delighted to have heard the last presentation and really deeply moved by it. And every community has its vulnerable people. And the vulnerable people are going to change depending on the society. It will almost always be poor people, immigrants, refugees, the children. Today in America, we are part of that vulnerable community. We don't have a monopoly on it, but we're among it. African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, and it goes on and on. What do we have to say with respect to suffering locally and globally? And then the third issue for me is, how do we be true to our own existence, to the reality of our own life, but constantly be looking to connect our lives and our suffering to other people's lives and other people's suffering? In what way, as a furry, brown, Iranian American, do I begin not by looking to the super rich and powerful, but rather by the other fellow people in my society who are also at the moment finding themselves weak and vulnerable? For us as Muslims, and particularly as I look around this room, as Muslims of transnational or immigrant background, whatever term you want to use for it, there is an idol that I think we have created. And we thrive on it, we feast on it, we boast on it, we broadcast it, and that idol is success. we preach success. We indoctrinate our children in success. And believe me, if you are around the kinds of universities that Abdullah and I are, from day one, we want you to be successful. Right? And I keep asking, what does success mean? And the only answer I can get from most people, being rich. Being rich. We're going to get treated to sublime music tonight. Really nice to meet you, brother. I also grew up listening to classical Arab, Persian, Turkish, Qawwali music, but also have to admit, I grew up on hip-hop. Right? Wu-Tang Clan, Cream. Cash rules everything around me, but doesn't have to rule me. What does it mean to stand up in the very midst of a consumerist, materialist society and say, I want something for myself and for my children and for my community which is beyond success, and what I want is greatness. Greatness, and we're going to measure it by the extent to which we can take our accumulated resources and put it in the service of the most vulnerable people. That is the mark of genuine greatness. It requires those resources, because without it, we can't do our work. But it means that it's not about me, it's not about my children, it's not about my community, it's about taking care of other members of our fellow humanity. It's what in the African tradition you call Ubuntu. I can't be fully human unless you're fully human. And I want to bring it back and talk about where we stand today, where our feet are. And I talked about this moment of the crumbling of this American empire. And let us not be under any delusions. Right? We are seeing a vast geopolitical transformation. We've gone from the Cold War to a brief period of time where America was the unipolar ruler of the world. Economically, that's already passed. Right? You see China, India is not far behind. The United States is sliding back down to being one of the 4 or 5 most powerful economies. But you also see the toll of empire and the weight that it has in America. This is, of course, what happens to empires. Every empire collapses. And if you have any denial or doubts or questions about whether or not we are today an empire, ask this simple question. What other country around the world gives itself permission to put military bases on the soil of over 100 countries? Only one. What other country in the world spends more on its military than the next 12 countries combined, and Republican and Democrat line up to agree? Only one. This America, this beautiful, look at this, gorgeous, blessed land is now and has always been both a dream and a nightmare. The same Dr. King who stood there and said, I have a dream, ends his life by saying, I also realize that America is a nightmare for many people. That barzakh, that isthmus, is where we are situated. We have to hang on to the noble idea of America as a dream, while at the same time never losing sight of the fact that it was never a dream for many. America began through a genocidal campaign of Native Americans. It begins as a full participant in a process of transatlantic slavery that includes shipping 12 million human beings across and having around 2 million of them die en route, where women were excluded from the idea of what it means to be citizen. Where do we stand? if a measure of being a global citizen is not just to critique those folks out there, but also to be willing to critique our own self, we have to be honest enough to know that when our folks arrived in this country, we did not begin by challenging that racist model of citizenship. We begged and pleaded and took court case after court case that said, how can I be white? And if you don't know this history, go back and look at how the definition of what it meant to be an American citizen was defined as a free adult white male citizen. And from 1914 to 1923, Arab Americans, some of the earliest of the Muslim immigrants, begged and pleaded with the US Supreme Court. You've already decided Jews are white. We're just like Jews. We want to be white too. We did not stop and say, what about blacks? Why are they left out of the whole process? How can I wrap up my identity alongside not the rich and the powerful and the folks that have made it, but along those who are in the basement of the house? That moral stance of doing what's right and standing with the weakest people on earth is where I would like to see us as global citizens standing in this very difficult moment. When we do that, and if we do that, and I'm going to shut up in 1 minute. If we do that, and when we do that, then you're going to see that you and I have allies. That the same people who are marching in Ferguson understand that the tear gas canisters fired upon them were also being fired upon Palestinians. They understand that the same police force of the state of Missouri was sent to Israel for so-called counterterrorism training. By linking together our consciousness, our citizenship, our resources, we can do something really beautiful. Let me end with that same note that you just heard about education. America today is functionally an illiterate society. I've had the good fortune of publishing a few books. My last book on the life of the Prophet was published by the largest mainstream press in America, HarperCollins. What the marketing team there told me is that Americans who buy books, who read books, 30% of Americans haven't touched a book in the last year. You can't have a democracy when the folks are so ill-informed. The ones who read books are reading at a 6th grade level. This is America, the richest country in the history of humanity. What do we have to say? America's views of us keeps going down the tube. After 9/11, 49% of Americans had a positive view of us. 2010, it was 36%. Now it's 27%. There's no other religious or ethnic community that has such an unfavorable view. But study the history of this country. Every community that has ever succeeded and become great has done so by investing in education. The Catholics, Jews, and others. We as Muslims are not there yet. One thing that America still leads the world is universities. We have 3,000 universities and colleges across this beautiful land. Less than 10% of them have faculty members devoted to the study of Islam. Of the ones that do, a majority of them have been produced in programs that are completely Orientalist in their training, which present Islam as a dead civilization where our best days were 1,000 years ago. What Abdullah and I are trying to do is to establish a different model for what it means to be unapologetically Muslim, self-critical, and deeply committed to the survival and redemption of the American experiment, but not by just wearing a lapel on our flag, not by just waving the US Constitution, by taking the dream and the nightmare both seriously and to dedicating ourselves to that resurrection. Thank you for that permission.
Assalamu alaikum, and you are welcome. What do you do when you are invited for a mission which is bigger than you and you feel like you are a fraud? You pull in someone who is real, who's hakiki, who's authentic, and who will do the job. It's a privilege and honor to be with Brother Omid and in his close companion and colleague. You've been sitting for almost an hour and a half. How about just standing up and shaking up a little bit? Let the blood flow. How to be a global citizen and how to talk about global citizenship. As a chaplain and imam, my job is to work in the field of emotions and work with the inner side, the unseen side of the world, which relates to humanity. And therefore, to do this a little bit dialogically, when you heard to become a global citizen, is this a good thing or a bad thing? What is your immediate emotional reaction? How many people think global citizenship, to become a global citizen, it's a dream? It's a dream come true, that there is an emerging global world out there with set of values which transcends people's religious, ethnic, national, even citizenship identities. And we will be somehow in one day governed by these emerging global human values, where those differences which divides us, or the governance of affairs, economy, education, and the affairs of the world which are run by nation states will not be the case. So how many people think being a global citizen is a good thing? It's a dream. Yeah. How many people think it's a nightmare? It's absolutely a horror story. Because it imposes, it challenges enormously, which I was going to go in detail. One of the funniest global citizenship accidents I have done is 2 or 3 weeks ago. I performed the nikah of a Chinese-American Muslim girl. She's not convert. Her parents from China. They've been Muslim for 1,000 years. They are as Chinese as an apple pie. Well, not quite. They are as Chinese as dumpling or noodle, and she came and grew up in the United States. And a Pakistani, half white boy. And you should have really seen, when you perform the nikah, you see the whole crowd. And there are people who are dreamers of global citizenship. To see a Chinese-American Muslim girl getting married to a half-white, half-Pakistani boy, and a Turkish imam is performing the nikah, this is the climax of global citizenship, where the whole world comes together in unity and peace. But I swear God, half of the room, forget about smiling, as if they are baptized with lemon juice. They are so unhappy to be in that room. They are so unhappy with the picture that they have to see. They are so unhappy with the kind of reality that they have gone through, that they had dreams about their children, which these global, citizenship is ruining. But how many people think these are irrelevant questions, whether it's a dream or a nightmare? Where I wanted to spend most of my time, which I will also say more in the Q&A section. How many people believe the value-added conversation about global citizenship almost a waste of time? I am from that madhab, that school of thought, because it's a reality. It's already happening, whether you like it or not. And whether you like it or not, this is going to take an incredible amount of work to figure out how are we going to be as we spend the whole morning with Marilyn's beautiful presentation, how are we going to remain as and the values invested in that in my religious identity, in my personal ethnic identity, and how are we going to become we, but not at the expense of my as Omid beautifully said. How are we going to resist this force globally shaping our worldview, our insights, the way we see things, and shaping our lenses, we see the things through the prism of these global realities. And how are we going to filter it through the universal, never changing, the ethical, moral values of our cultures, traditions, and more importantly, Islam? How are we in this kind of in the face of this forceful phase, how are we global citizens, but at the same time, be a faithful stewards of these universal values that we are asked to transmit into our younger generations? One thing this global citizenship does, I'm 41 years old. I lived in 4 countries in 3 continents. And the house that I live is about, I think that makes me a global citizen, isn't it? Couple of citizenship, few languages here and there. But my son, who is 10, when he was 6, 7, he used to introduce himself. I am a Muslim, Turkish, American, Southern Spider-Man. It gives you hyphenated identities. In what set of values and criteria, in what kind of scales are we going to filter these forced to become one? We will jump into a pool, a melting pot, as often global citizenship is concerned, but we are not going to shed those continuity that should be kept. One of the most beautiful Protestant Christian prayers that I have incorporated into my life, which is very relevant, again, in the context of global citizenship, the Niebuhr, early 20th century theologian, who felt, as a Protestant in the United States, this global reality is forcing him, his religious, cultural, and citizenship identity. His prayer was, "Oh God, give me the strength to change what needs to be changed." This inevitable, already happening, whether you like it or not, is going to hit you, your children, and your grandchildren reality. It's going to force you to change things. Global citizen American Muslims will not be able to live their life the way their ancestors have lived. It's the obvious, but in reality, it's a lot more painful. Seeing this inevitable change as American Muslims living in the United States in a post-9/11 world, where we are under sort of certain troubling spotlights, how are we going to have the kind of courage, strength, and more importantly, strength, as he prayed, to change what needs to be changed? And he prays, "Give me the courage to keep what needs to be kept." Give me, again, the strength and the courage to keep what needs to be kept. But more importantly, his third line in the prayer is unbelievably beautiful. "Give me the wisdom, oh God. Give me the wisdom to understand the difference." I think if it is a dream or a nightmare, we are tasked by global forces to have the courage to keep what needs to be kept, but also have the strength to go ahead and change what needs to be changed. That's the task in shaping our global citizenship identity, as we also keep those universal values and norms and ethical principles that Quran and the Sunnah and all these 1400 years of wisdom who has been invested in our hands to transmit into the next generation. Let me pause here. I was going to go a little bit more, but let's open up the conversation, because I really want you to benefit from the wisdom and the guidance of Dr. Omid Safi. Thank you, and Jazakallah khair.
Thank you very much. Brother Safi, I have a question for you. You mentioned the term collapse for the empire. Did you mean collapse, the meaning we know, or it's the other meaning of declining?
You know, I think you can measure collapse in lots of different ways. In an older time period, perhaps, let's take the Empire of Rome for a second. Collapse would have meant succumbing to tribes of Central European barbarian savages, whatever, coming in and physically destroying. I actually see what's happening in America as a much more subtle process. I'm not worried about the Canadians coming and taking over the place. Every Canadian I've met here has just been so lovely and kind, and if they ever stepped in, they'll probably apologize 50 times over about having kindly intruded on your space. The collapse I'm talking about is the dissolution of our social fabric, of the social contract. of the notion that there is such a thing as we the people. We the people. I think what we're seeing in America is the formation of lots and lots of sub-communities. And many of us, and I might even put myself in that context as well, are now locked into echo chambers where we are losing, if not have already lost, the common room, the living room, the public room in which we can have difficult, honest, self-critical dialogue about the collective we. What's happening is that those of us on the leftish side of the spectrum are listening to NPR, or if you're a tree-hugging communist like me, to Amy Goodman, may God bless her and grant her the highest realm of Jannat. And then if you are somewhere on the right, you know, you watch Fox News, and you keep being force-fed preconceived notions rather than being challenged to deepen, to grow, to revise, to adapt in some ways. The reason I keep coming back to we're losing the we, the people, is let's just take it, we all have seen the calligraphic representation of it. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. Right? Not we, the people, because we're already perfect. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect, right? We are in progress towards becoming kinder, gentler, more inclusive, overcoming the racism and the sexism of our ancestors. And if we want to do so, what's the path? Establish justice. It's the we, the people, actually being a collectivity that corresponds to all of us, starting with that theme of justice. And of course, what all of our religious traditions teach us, and if there's one thing that I hope I've said today that may stay with you, this is to me one of the hearts of the Islamic tradition, one of the hearts of the Christian and the Jewish tradition. It's the reason why we're told, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ, where justice and ihsan, everything that has to do with love and beauty, are linked up together in the Quran. And what our sages tell us from the American tradition, from the black liberationist tradition of Dr. King and others, justice is simply what we call love when it's in public. Justice is simply the agreement and the arrangements for the we that we would insist on if I wanted to have it for my own babies, and I would insist for it to exist for everybody's babies. That's what justice is. Justice is fundamentally a commitment to love. And we know that from the Quran, we know that from the better parts of the Jewish and the Christian tradition, and inshallah we can be participants in living it.
And if I may tie quickly into the whole global citizenship issue, global citizenship, unless many of the dreamers, it requires you to be more invested in the I before you become one. Therefore, global citizenship requires a home. So by home not being in order, in the beautiful explanation, declining, you go around the world. We are missing the train. That our success and our size blinded us as Americans in general, American Muslims in particular, in the trends of the projections of the global realities. Unfortunately, we are not playing the role the way we used to play. And therefore, in several decades, our global citizenship will mean something incredibly challenging for Americans in general, again, American Muslims in particular, if we don't follow these trends, if it's answering your question.
Thank you. I know Saud's giving me bad looks. I think he feels I've overstepped my quota for questions. But I've actually got a comment and a question. You know, first of all, I really liked, primarily with Omid, I really like what you said about, you know, we have to be self-critical, but not apologetic. I don't know if anyone saw, there was on the BBC, just I think the day before yesterday, there was something going on Twitter, where I think on some forum, you know, with ISIS and whatever is going on, some news had broken out, and some Muslim professionals had started tweeting that we're really sorry, this is not our religion, and we're sorry for what is happening. And that was passed on about 1,000 or a few thousand times. And then eventually someone said, listen, I'm not really sorry, this is not Islam, this has nothing to do with me, why should I be apologetic? And a new Twitter started that I apologize for creating algebra. We apologize for all the strides in mathematics that Muslims did. We apologize for creating the first university. Yeah, they said that too. They said we're very sorry for capitalism. So it was really amazing. If you read those tweets, it went on, and I think it was very appropriate because, you know, we need to stop expecting ourselves to be apologetic, and others need to do the same. So that was one part. The other thing I wanted to come to, Omid, something you mentioned last night when we were talking is that you were once in a conversation with one of the leaders of the civil rights movement who'd been through it all, and he had said that it is very interesting. I think this is the beauty of being in this country as well, is that there have been many different, you know, ethnic or racial populations who've gone through significant discrimination in the past. And as they've been fighting that and fighting for their rights, they end up driving or end up defining the moral compass of their times. And that was exactly, I mean, during the civil rights movement, it were the African Americans who were actually defining for the country where that moral compass should stand. And he appropriately had told you that Muslims are the likely contenders of where we stand. But I don't really see us holding or defining that moral compass. In your opinion, are we doing a good job of that? If not, what are we not doing right? I mean, we should be the ones, you know, holding, you know, people to that standard, which I don't see a lot happening.
Thank you. So I'll just start, and I'm sure Abdullah can take it to the higher level, is a moral compass or the mantle of the moral center of a society isn't something that you can claim. It's not something that you can just get the website for it and then now I've got it, moralcompass.org, or in more likely in America.com, as the case might be. It's something that you are given through a demonstrated track of action. And you know, we were having this conversation this morning. Where are the parallels between all these conversations of social entrepreneurship and transformation and the richness of our own tradition, but then what's the new thing? What's the different particularity that our tradition also has to offer? And one of the grounds of our tradition is nothing great is ever accomplished without suffering. If you want to attain to greatness, we have to be willing to pay a price. And a price doesn't have to be dollars. Sometimes it's being attacked, being critiqued, being marginalized, and to keep your moral core, which is to say the heart, through those very attacks. Now, what's interesting is go back to the civil rights era, and as we were talking about it last night, I've taken a number of years to be mentored by some of the surviving elders of the civil rights era. And one of the insights that I was sharing with people over dinner last night and with Abdullah was that they never actually called it the civil rights movement. The only phrase they ever had for it was the freedom movement. And they said that's why when we went to India, and that's why when we went to Africa, we saw their struggle and our struggle as one struggle. Because they were struggling to be free and we were struggling to be free. That's a model that I would like to see us as Muslims do. So that I care and will passionately to my dying breath argue for the full citizenship rights of Palestinians. At the same time, as I continue to speak against the segregation wall, what about the wall that's now dividing us from Mexico? And it's actually through those kinds of partnerships where Palestinian families that are now divided across this evil, unjust, immoral, illegal wall are living a reality which is completely parallel to the lives of Hispanic families, half of whom are in Mexico, half of whom are in America. That's a freedom cause that we have to be invested in. We have to be willing to pay a price for. And I know the price that I've had to pay is having periodic articles come out dismissing me as an anti-Semite, as a this and that. Fine, hit delete, move on. They can go and say things about me, but not stop me from the work that needs to be done. If there is a moral credibility, it's that suffering. And because I'm a Muslim, and because my inspiration comes from the Quran, I go back to the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam. He was always Ibrahim, and then he was thrown into the flames. And it's when he emerges from the flames that he becomes the Khalil. Right? And if you read the tradition and the commentaries, the flames turn into a rose garden for him. We are now in the midst of the flame. We are in the midst of a at least 13-year, and in some ways longer, flame of American xenophobia. We can either burn up in the process, or, inshallah, we can emerge Khalil-like into a level of closeness to God that we haven't had before. The choice depends on our own spiritual condition. Will we give in to the rancor, the hatred, the bitterness, the evil that is being targeted towards us? Will we drink from that poison and speak that poison? Or are we willing to say, I will not go down this path? There's a model of freedom that's not just about my freedom, but the freedom of all other marginalized, weak, and vulnerable people. I will not usurp your voice, but I will amplify your voice. And I will do it from the Civic Center, from the university, from every corner of this land.
Imam Antepli, when you ask that it's a good to be a global citizen or it's a nightmare, actually I raise my hand both way. When your first question, I raise my hand, and your second question, I also raise my hand. I think it depends from where you are applying your citizenship. So being an American citizen, I think you are already considered to be a global citizen. So when we are discussing all these things, I think like the most important thing is that, as it was just described by your fellow, that when we talk
Fellow Blue Devil.
when we talk about this, then we need to consider also the people who are applying this citizenship for so-called for the global citizen from the less fortunate area, or the underdeveloped area, or wherever the more powerful people are going and targeting them. So they should also have the same rights of the freedom as we are enjoying being a global citizen here in the United States of America. So that is the question. And then if we can improve ourselves here, how are we going to be able to help those less fortunate in the rest of the world? Thank you.
I think it ties into the previous question as well, that in order to be a moral campus, morality is not an oral tradition. It's not something that you say. It's not a written tradition, that's something that you read. Morality is a living tradition. You have to live up to the level of moral legitimacy in the eyes of fellow Americans in the United States, and so that you can be the moral campus. Otherwise, by just saying moral things or pointing out the moral failures, by just speaking, writing about it, it's not, and in the eyes of many Americans, unfortunately, we have a room for improvement in earning, if we be self-critical, earning that moral legitimacy, especially among the immigrant communities, first, second, and third generations. When we are seen as somebody who committed to this land, but critically, and with the commitment that I'm not just going to assimilate, but I will bring something, I will contribute. But I believe I'm fully citizen. You know, just last week, I don't think we are there. I don't want to sort of spray pessimism, but I don't think for many, many immigrants, we don't necessarily mean when we say we are American. We have yet to, even ourselves, forget about what Fox TV thinks of us. Last week, I was in New York, going through one meeting after another, having dinners with foreign government, head of states, prime ministers, etc. And I watched these American Muslim leaders, national leaders' reaction to a foreign leader. They are a lot more comfortable with some foreign leaders than they are comfortable with Obama. It's unbelievable. There is some sort of a disconnect there. Once we basically become a living reality in being American, not by just saying it, by writing it, by not just by our passports, but if we become a living reality that we are here, deeply invested, and wanted to be an ethical, moral community and solved American problems. Dr. Sherman Jackson always brings this, I hope I'm not making a bad comparison. Dr. Sherman Jackson, who's an African-American Muslim leader, who says, ask any Muslim on any given Muslim issue. They will give you 45 minutes straight lecture. Women in Islam, jihad in Islam, Palestine, Kashmir. Not that these are not important, but ask them, what is affirmative action? What is an affirmative action? See if they can say mumble like 5 minutes. This is the history of it, this is what it is, these are the pluses and minuses. It's so evident, it's hard to fake morality. It's such an important, I'm not saying we are not immoral, but I think if we are not there to fake it by talking and writing and saying, it doesn't convince anybody. It does not. We can't fake it. As Sherman Jackson again said, you ain't fake this thing. You have to live it. We have to get there and become as American as an apple pie, in our living reality. Again, this doesn't mean wholesale acceptance of American policy or American foreign policy or economic policy, etc. As you will see in a healthy society with a lot of anger, resentments, questioning as well. Inshallah, when we get there, we will not be afraid of death. And to me, my students, they are more fearful of death than one thing Omid just said. They don't care about death, I think, in that age. They are more afraid. They are scared to death about being unsuccessful. This is their religion. This is what they've been told. They are so scared that they are not going to go to medical school. And then that means they will never see the gates of Jannah, God forbid. Because they are told that's what the religion of Islam is asking them to fulfill. There's a much bigger fears, not just physical death, but being unsuccessful is crumpling us. And defining success, unfortunately and regretfully, only by the size of your salary, house, and material means.
This is a question that goes to both of you. Dr. Safi, you talked about a global Muslim reaching out to the disadvantaged. And Dr. Antepli, you talked about this commitment towards equality and justice. So as a Muslim global citizen, what are you supposed to do when you're faced with the reality of something that's clearly directed by the 14th Amendment and indirectly implied by the 5th Amendment, which is equal protection and the rights for gays to marry? What do you do then?
So, you know, there's a wonderful American philosopher by the name of Chris Rock that you might be familiar with. He's a... So, he has a brilliant take on marriage, and as a person that has suffered, nothing great can be accomplished without suffering. So I've suffered in marriage for 15 years, alhamdulillah. Keep on suffering, alhamdulillah, and may the suffering and the greatness increase. Chris Rock's take on gay marriage is, yeah, let them be as miserable as the rest of us. My view on it, and I've written this, is I actually adopt the exact same point of view that Keith Ellison does, one of the two Muslim American congressmen, which is that gay marriage, marriage as such, is a civic issue. It is not one that as a Muslim, as a Christian, as a Jew, as a Hindu, as a Buddhist, should be legislated, but purely as a matter of, and it's not the job of a government to be telling Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and Jains and whoever what their religious tradition should say. But from a simple matter of secular law, you're right, under those constitutional protections, we can't prevent anyone from having access to the same institutions. And I think that bifurcation, which preserves for religious communities the right to say, we have a tradition and we have a consensus, and the consensus of our tradition has reached this opinion, but as a matter of secular law, that same system that guarantees us rights, even as they're being violated left and right, is the same right that other citizens have an appeal to.
And we are not only speaking, but we are putting where our money, where our mouth is. Both of us publicly supported Keith Ellison. I as an imam, Omid as an academic, what you think, what your beliefs in religion and theology and religious norms. We have in our tradition, like how much of it as a minority we can impose on other people. And how much of it is a religious issue, how much of it is a fairness, justice issue. And what supersedes your religious commitments. And like even within the law, you can navigate those, especially if you are a minority, especially you are not in charge. And it looks so bad on American Muslim community, receiving all that support from gay communities, gay activists. And then when they want our support, we don't know where is the nearest exit. And that looks so bad on us. That looks absolutely so bad on us.
Let me also add one other thing, which is, again, we have to know the history of where we stand. Let's go back and take a look at how, starting in the 1980s, when the Republican Party in this country, and I hope we don't have any Republicans here because I'm about to bash them, when they recognized that their party was becoming a marginalized Southern white male party that demographically was going out of style, they decided very strategically to start playing two cards. One of them was to cultivate a series of values, family values, moral values. We just had the Values Summit meeting in DC, which couldn't make up its mind if it's about abortion and family values or is about who hates Muslims more. And when you're standing where I am and you're looking at folks who are speaking the language of family values, and Michelle Bachmann looks like the most moderate of them, that's where we have to figure out who are your allies in this. As Muslims, as citizens, as human beings, we have every right to cultivate sophisticated positions on abortion, on gay marriage, on sexuality, on the whole range of issues that anybody else does. The larger question that I want to see the American Muslim community have is not fall into the trap of wedge politics, but is rather to ask the simple, fundamental, undeniable question. Why is it that when I go to my congressman and I say, I want to have decent public accommodations, I'm told we can't afford it? Why is it that when I ask for good quality public school systems, I'm told we can't afford it? Why is it that when I ask for support for the environment, we can't afford it? We want universal health care, we can't afford it. We want to take care of our elderly, we can't afford it. Why is it that when we want to take care of our precious babies, we can't afford it, but somehow magically we can open up the bank vault and we can keep writing checks for these wars of choice, which, let's keep track of it, have cost us $4,000 billion in the last decade. The militarism of the country that you and I call home not only has death consequences for people in Gaza, people in Syria, people in Iraq, people in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, it also means that here in this country, we don't have money for the most vulnerable people. Not that we don't have money, we choose not to allocate the money. What I would like to see our community do right after or right before supporting us at Duke University, build a really kick-ass Islamic studies program, would be listen to the words of the great sages that came before. Remember Dr. King, before he was shot, saying, a nation that spends more on its military than it does on programs of social uplift is approaching, and this is his word, spiritual death. If that was true in 1967, what would he say? What do we have to say about America in 2014? It's on those kinds of issues that I want to see us be bold, be principled, and informed, and committed to salvaging what is left of the American dream.
And in all the challenges and opportunities that we've been talking since yesterday, and we will continue to talk tomorrow, we have pretty much all we need. And one of the few things that we don't have is exactly what Cafe is providing to us, space to talk. Otherwise, money, intellectual power, professionalism, status, credibility in the American society, that we can make these maneuvers. Therefore, I'm eternally grateful for Cafe leadership for this idea in the mountains of West Virginia, not in the liberal halls of New York or San Francisco or Chicago. It's so beautiful that let's own this project. And let's take it to next level and next level, inshallah. This is another promotional fundraising event, but we can have half of these conversations in most mosques today. We can have conventions. We cannot have these conversations. The fact that these strangers come together without nobody picking fight or calling each other kafir, we are having these conversations. This is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's sort of responding to the very urgent need of Muslim community for third spaces where we can be who we are and have an honest brotherly, sisterly conversation. Thank you for Cafe leadership. Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair.